Well, hey, Vibrant, welcome to episode 4 of the Next Level Coffeecast for the Watch the Throne series. My name is Zach Garrett. I'm the growth pastor here at Vibrant. And with me today, I have Alex Robinson. Now, Alex is more of our behind the scenes guy. He's our video editing.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, video editing and worship production, basically.
Yeah, you'll see him in the sound box. So he's not the guy up on the stage, but my goodness, he makes so much of what is vibrant through his technological skills and what he does behind the scenes. He's such a huge asset to the team and somebody that I am very grateful to have with me for today's Coffee Cast. So everybody give a welcome to Alex. And we are having to do the Coffee Cast a little differently than what we planned this time.
Yeah.
Alex is in you live in New Cumberland? No.
Just south of there. I live in Edders, Pennsylvania.
You live in Edders. Yeah, Edders. That's right. He's in Edders. I'm in Carlisle. We're both in our own respective homes due to a little thing called quarantine right now.
Yes.
But we agreed that you can't have a coffee cast if you're not sipping coffee.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about a minute about our home brews.
Okay.
So Alex, let me ask you, what do you prefer to drink at home?
So, honestly, most days I'm just pretty practical. Like, I will just use a standard like drip coffee maker most days. The coffee that I put in it has to be somewhat decent for me. I'm not like, I'm definitely not like a huge, like I'll drink any kind of coffee. Like, honestly, I'll drink any kind of coffee. I might put a lot of cream in it or something, but, the coffee I brew at home is at least decent coffee. Sometimes, I will grind the beans. Sometimes I'll just get them pre-ground. That stuff doesn't matter as much to me. I'm just really practical because I like to drink a lot of coffee in the morning. So some of the other options like pour over or French press, while I've done those in the past, just aren't super practical, like when I'm not awake in the morning. So I love being able to push the button. Like sometimes I'll even pre-make the coffee at night, and it's just a magical thing when you can either, like I even have a delay brew feature.
Yeah.
If that coffee is like already made when I come down in the morning, that's
right.
That's amazing to me.
And that smell is already in your kitchen.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Now today I French pressed my coffee because I knew that I couldn't compete with your, probably home roasted beans. So I thought I got to at least, up the brewing game.
And I love French press. The only complaint that I've had with that and your pour overs, like your Chemex, is that in those glass containers, it loses heat so fast.
Yeah.
But I've seen that they make stainless steel or vacuum sealed French presses, which really keep your coffee hot. Now, you said I'll admit, this is not my home roasted. I do roast my own coffee every now and then, but every now and then I can't pass up just a bag of Dunkin' Donuts coffee.
Oh, Dunkin' Donuts, huh?
Yeah, I'm not really a Starbucks guy.
Yeah. I get Starbucks, and I drink Starbucks all the time. And I don't like Pike's Place a lot.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of people say that. They actually roast that locally, I guess, from what I understand. Yeah, is that right? Down in York?
Down in York, right? Yeah.
Well, and just past where we're at, like you can even see the roasting plant or whatever off of 83. But wow. I don't mind, like if that's all that's available, like that's definitely going to be my go-to for sure. But Dunkin' Donuts, Dunkin' Donuts is a big deal around here. Like I didn't grow up in this area, but Dunkin' Donuts is like, a lot of people like Dunkin' coffee, and apparently America runs on it. So
it's smoother, in my opinion. If I'm going to just go for a black cup of coffee, actually my favorite is Caribou. I don't think, but there's no Caribou coffees around here.
No.
But Starbucks for me is just too acidic.
Yeah.
Now, I'll go to Starbucks and I'll get, espresso that's put into something, or I might even get an Americano, because their espresso is fine. But I'm like you, their standard coffee brews, their coffee blends, I think one way that they get their consistency and flavor is they burn their beans. They roast them extra long.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah, that's the key complaint. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but it's it's I feel like it's better than a lot of the alternatives still. As much as we could complain about Starbucks, I still like it compared to a lot of
The best
alternatives.
part of waking up is not Folgers in my cup.
No, no, it is not.
Well, hey, let's jump into Drew's sermon from Sunday. When you are comparing.
Yeah.
Now, as I was digesting it and I was reflecting upon my own life, and Alex, this may be your story, maybe it's different, but I feel like comparisonitis, as Drew said,
Oh yeah.
has certainly been more and it's been less apparent in my life depending on the season.
Yeah.
My young
Yeah, I don't know if it's even seasonal for me. I mean, personality wise, I am prone to comparison like all day long. Like
Wow.
it's a real struggle for me. Even coming into this call, we were talking about like, well, Zach's gonna have his own roasted beans. I gotta that's a comparison, right? Or like before we started the call, like, well, I got to make up for not having those roasted beans. So I'm going to get an actual like microphone out because I like edit videos and people might compare what I sound like. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it might sound silly to some people, but
No.
comparison is a living, breathing, thing for me for sure.
Well, and you and I guess maybe we can share this. A lot of what we do and we find success in what we do is based on how other people are pleased with it.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It makes sense. I mean that's true of a lot of jobs. But for me in my content writing or when I get the opportunity to preach, or Alex, for you the video
Yeah.
and the graphic design that you put out, the accomplishment you feel is on how
Mm-hmm.
people react to it or how they're reacting to other people.
Yeah.
And I know for a
Yeah.
lot of pastors, the danger is you start comparing yourself to other preachers out there, or their congregation sizes, or how many books they're selling, or
Yeah.
maybe in your line of work, who's getting contracts with big, advertisement companies. What kind of video are they editing and putting out there? And so you almost create your own self-worth based on how successful you are next to the other people
Yeah.
around you.
Yeah, well, and you don't even know, like, part of determining success is comparison, I think. At least for me, like, looking around, I'm so tempted to look around and be like, if I'm, like, subconsciously asking the question, what does it look like to be successful? I'm really looking and comparing what I'm doing to other people who are doing the same or similar things. And then that can at times be like, we can learn by watching other people do things. So I mean, like, it's not like sin to like see what other people are doing and want to be like them. But when it crosses, I think for me, like it crosses that border into that pursuit of success by looking at what other people that I deem to be successful and trying to be like them without really asking, who is it that God's created me to be, and so then I just end up parroting them instead of just being like God created us in his own image, right? Like as we have this creative bent ourselves, and that can easily become, it can really easily become like cheapened by trying to just be other people or be like other people rather than to really lean into what God's gifted us with.
Well, for our audience here, if you don't know this, Alex Robinson, his wife is Jamie Robinson, our online campus pastor.
Yep.
And she did the first Next Level Coffeecast episode 1 with me. And one of the things that we mentioned when we were talking about David, and I was talking about Eliab, the first son that was, that went before Samuel, probably the firstborn son of Jesse. And Samuel looks at him and thinks, hey, surely here's the king. And God says to Samuel, hey, I don't look at what you look at. You look at the outside, I look at the heart.
Yeah.
But Eliab's story didn't end there.
Yeah.
he didn't get, I don't say overlooked in the sense that God forsook him, but he got overlooked, that he didn't get chosen for the throne. But that doesn't mean that his life, his significance was over. But for him to then compare himself to his littlest brother, David, and
Yeah.
go, wow, David's success and me, not accomplishing that, then must be reflective of my worth in God's eyes.
Mm.
It's a lie. It's
Yeah.
false.
Yeah.
Eliab, hey, God's purpose for you was to not be the king of Israel, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't love you. That doesn't mean that God doesn't have a purpose for you, and that you can't still have a full life serving the living God and still having an impact in the way that God has called you to be a kingdom worker in your own specific way.
Yeah.
It would have been destructive, as we so often do, for Eliab to compare himself then to the successes of his brother David.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that is so fascinating. Like, there's so many different people written about in the Bible that we don't get to hear their stories, and especially like those kind of redemptive arcs like that. But one of my favorite passages of Scripture is in Romans, and Paul is talking about Abraham and Sarah at the time, and how Sarah was barren, and yet even in her old age, she was able to have children because of what God was doing. And Paul says something like, the God who gives life to the dead and calls the things that are not as though they were. And I think that's like over and over again, the story all through the Bible is God using people, not because of their accomplishments or success or, because people looked at them and thought that they were, should be the king. Nobody was looking at David and thinking that this little, shepherd boy should be the king, but because that was God's will, wholly and completely. And you could go down the list, in the Bible, not only of God's people struggling with comparison, but God choosing to use the things and the people that nobody was comparing anything to. Even like, so the people in Israel, they looked for a king. They were comparing themselves to like other people around, other countries around them.
Yeah.
Other nations. We want a king. They have a king. And God's like, no, this is what's going to happen if you get a king, but okay, I'll allow it. But that's comparison. And like, you could do that over and over again with every single story. And in each of those, it's like God also kind of upsets the apple cart. Like, he turns like what they would expect, he does like something that nobody would expect, out of that situation. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah. Alex, I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Yeah.
In one sentence, could you give me what is the root of comparison? Like I said, I'm really putting you on the spot here, but I think we can. I want us to nail it down to a person who just needs to go, I didn't think of it like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess it's it's wanting to. Is it kind of like, so the root, in one sentence, what's the root of comparison?
What's the root of comparison?
I think, maybe we go back to Genesis, and this isn't one sentence. I'm trying to figure out what my one sentence is, but maybe we go back to Genesis, and again, comparison, you could probably like highlight comparison in every single story written in the Bible. And you look at Adam and Eve, and what does the serpent do? What does Satan do? He asks Eve to compare what they have with what he can promise them. And so they give up what they have for what they think they deserve, in one way. And so I think that's maybe in one sentence, kind of that root of comparison, going back to that very original sin of Adam and Eve, like giving up this desire to have something more. Is maybe, for me anyway, the root of comparison. And so that desire to have something more comes from some kind of lie that I don't have enough. And that's comparison in a nutshell, isn't it? Like, you aren't smart enough. You aren't handsome enough. You aren't whatever those things that you aren't you don't have enough money. Whatever the thing that we're struggling
Mm-hmm.
with, that to me gets at the root of comparison. Is this you aren't enough, and so we must need more from something else.
And I'm going to cheat. You didn't have a resource. I have a book. It's one of my favorite books, Ruthless Trust by Brennan Manning.
Oh, I love Brennan Manning.
Yeah, he also wrote the book, The Ragamuffin Gospel.
Yeah.
And this is a follow-up book from him.
I haven't read that one.
He says this. He says, the basic premise of biblical trust is the conviction that God wants us to grow, to unfold, and to experience fullness of life. And I think here the comparison, the pride, the jealousy that came in the garden was Adam and Eve listening to the lies of Satan, of him saying, God's holding out on you. You could have it better. You could have it better. And God's not letting you get there.
That's good.
And
yeah.
And so, it's the root. I think the root of comparison is not trusting that God wants us to grow, to unfold, and to experience fullness of life.
Yeah.
You look at the guy across the street and you go, God, why not? Why am I not like him? Why don't I have a house like that? Why don't I have children running in my front yard? Why don't? And I think God is then looking at us saying, why are you comparing yourself to them? Do you not trust that I want you to live in my fullness?
Yeah. And that's it. I think it's that move from I really resonate with that. And I think kind of like going back to that enough language, it's really coming to that, like you're saying, it's coming to the understanding. And I think this is a daily struggle. It's not something that we're gonna like just wake up one day and I made it. I arrived at this, but it's coming to the understanding over time that God is enough, that Jesus is enough, that there isn't something more out there, that where he's holding us back from, like you're saying, but that he is enough.
Yeah. So obviously, let me just shift gears a little bit, but this is absolutely going to go back into this.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's been a few years since either of us were in high school, or even college.
Yeah.
But maybe for the parent of an adolescent who's listening, or for those who are listening to this Coffeecast that fit in that junior high to college age range.
Yeah.
Which is really that, for me, is when I just had my life riddled with comparisonitis. I was looking at what I thought was the cool crowd, and I didn't drive the best car at high school, or I wasn't getting the scholarship opportunities, or I wasn't that good at sports, and so my whole life and feeling of worth was defined not by my trust in God, but by how I was not achieving what I thought everybody else was, living in.
Yeah.
So what practically changes, and I think we're already hitting on this, I just kind of want to put this together. What practically changes the mindset from comparing yourself to others to having contentment in who you are and what you have in the moment?
Yeah. That's a really great question. It's funny, like, I think even as a kid, you're talking about being a teenager, middle school, high schooler. I remember even earlier than that, like being with groups of friends and like everyone would have to kind of have like their thing, like, oh, he's really good at basketball, but, he's really good at football or what, like we always had to have like our thing. Like if we could own one thing, you know what I mean? Then it was like we were okay and we had worth and value, it's all, again, very subconscious. But yeah, what more practically, like, so what do we do about comparisonitis? Well, I think, Drew mentioned this idea that comparison is the thief of joy. And so I think when we start to understand, like, what is it that makes us feel the opposite of that in our lives? I was listening to a podcast the other day and the guy was talking about just writing out a list of the things that made him feel miserable. And I love that idea because that really gets at it, right? Like we could probably go through the day and figure out what are the things that don't make us feel good. What's robbing us of our joy. Write down a list of those things that are robbing us of our joy or making us miserable, and then see what we could do to change that. So if it's like for me, like I often will try to steal time at night, after everyone's gone to bed. I'll have this like script running in my head that if I stay up and watch another TV show or something, I can kind of steal back time from the day for myself, and it's never true. Like, it makes me feel miserable. I wake up the next morning, I'm like, why did I stay up so late watching, the latest, binge worthy TV? It right. it doesn't work. So, that to me, like, we could make a list of those things that rob us of our joy or make us feel miserable, and do the opposite of those things. I think another thing practically is comparing. If we're going to compare, not comparing ourselves to others, but to where we ourselves were earlier in our lives or our walk with Christ. So in other words, like, where am I at now in that walk with Jesus compared to last year? And maybe it's in a better place, maybe it's in a worse place, but that comparison is still helpful to me as I try to work out that salvation with fear and trembling, even as it's God who works in me to will and to act according to his good purpose.
So let me put this kind of maybe in an imagery. It's you're climbing up a mountain. And you keep looking up at the peak. You're like, oh, my goodness, it's so far away. The climb is so hard. Yeah. But every now and then you need to look behind you and go, oh, but look how far I've made it. Yeah. Wait. If I could climb up this far, oh, wow, I didn't realize that cliff was that sheer, or that, that edge was that, and you're looking back at your climb, you're going, whoa, wow, look how far I've come already. Yeah. It helps to put in perspective, I think I can make it to the summit. Yeah. And I want to touch on seasons, and I specifically hit on this adolescent age, this junior high school, because I know for me, I didn't, and I don't think I was living for Jesus. I wasn't this crazy, rebellious boy, but I certainly hope that in junior high and high school, my own kids live more in love with Jesus than what I did. But I didn't believe, or even I can't even say back then, that I was living in the fullness of God that I am today, whether that's self-inflicted or that's just how God designed my seasons of life. Yeah. That's a different conversation. But I think a good piece of encouragement for those who are going, well, I'm comparing my life to other people because I just don't feel that God is allowing me to live in fullness. Like, I don't feel full in this moment. Yeah. You go back to Abraham, you go back to Moses, you go back to David. David waited 20 years between his appointing and actually taking the throne. Yeah. Abraham waited, it was well over a decade between the promise of a son and whenever he actually had Isaac and had Ishmael in the middle of that. Yeah, and never got to see the final completion of the promises that God made to him. In terms of all nations being blessed through, like kind of the writer of Hebrews talking about, only together with us did they get to see that through Christ. I get what you're saying. Yeah. Well, and Moses grew up in the palace. He grew up in royalty, killed an Egyptian guard, ran and became a shepherd out in the desert. Yeah. And probably thought that his significant life was over. I mean, he was just going to kind of, just pitter patter along for us, till the end of his days. And then God says, hey, here's your moment. Here's what this has all been building up to. And yet, and just to like pause there for just a second, like, I think that's fascinating too, because when God calls him out of that wilderness time, he like enters into comparison, he goes all comparisonitis. To use the term. He's like, well, I can't speak well. The subtext is compared to people who do. You know what I mean? So like he struggles with comparison himself. Like, I can't do this, I can't do that. Okay, well, I'll give you Aaron, I'll give you, whatever. So like God he assures him and all those things, but it's like all these comparisons basically
that Moses is struggling with. I can't do this. I can't do that. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I'm just going to go back to that. And I know I'm kind of rocking out on this text here by Brendan Manning, but I think it's the trust that if you don't believe that you're experiencing the fullness of God in your moment right now,
Yeah.
it's continuing to trust that I don't need to compare my life to anybody else, that God's promised that He's going to work in all things for the good of those who love Him according to the promise to which they're called. So, God, I'm going to love you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to focus on you. I'm going to let your joy be my strength. And even though, God, I think there's other people around me right now that who have it better than I do, I know that ultimately someday, if not right now, there's going to come a day when I'm truly going to be satisfied and live in your fullness.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to wait for it, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to continue to follow you and be faithful, knowing that God, you don't fail. God,
Yeah.
you don't fail. And so I think the antithesis to comparisonitis is trust. Is
Mm.
trusting in the goodness of God that is just as promised to you as it was for Moses and Abraham and
Yeah.
David,
Yeah. That's
for
good.
Paul.
Oh man, and talk about Paul. Like I was thinking about this earlier, knowing that this call was coming up. Like I think Paul struggled with comparison majorly because he was always compared to other people. Like you look at
Hmm.
his letters to the church in Corinth, and especially like Second Corinthians, and they're like he basically has to defend himself because they're saying Apollos is better than you. Like or these other apostles, whoever it is, like these super
Yeah,
apostles that they were calling them, they're better than you, Paul. Like they're the church is comparing him. You know, it's like
yeah.
today, you know, people compare like different pastors or churches or whatever. And honestly, like it would be easy to say, I doubt people did that in the early church, but I think they did. I think
Hmm.
people were probably like, Peter's church is too big for me, you know, or
Yeah,
like I prefer John's church's music better, you know, or whatever the, you know, comparison was. You know, comparison is not just something that we struggle with on an individual level, but you know, we do it in the church as well and as believers even. And so in those, so again, like going back to Paul, then Paul always like he flips that on his head. He basically says, okay, so you're boasting about these guys. If I'm going to boast, I'm going to boast in my scars, basically.
hmm,
You know, if I'm going to compare myself to anyone, it's not these apostles, it's to Jesus.
yeah, yep.
And so he goes on, and it probably sounds a little bit crazy, you know, as they're reading this letter in their like local congregation there in Corinth. But he's like, you know, 5 times I received 40 lashes, and you know, whatever the list is, and he's like comparing his own suffering to Christ. Like that's the
Yes.
comparison, you know, like if we compared ourselves not to, and I'm talking to myself here again, it's a huge struggle for
Mm,
me, but if I learn to compare not to other people around me or to the culture around me, whatever it is, but to Jesus and his scars, I mean, that's something
mm.
that I think Paul would approve of. Yeah, I think that comparison issue was huge even in the early church.
Well, and I don't think there's any other way that we can come into perhaps one of the simplest but most profound statements of faith, where Paul says in Philippians, I think it's Philippians 4, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. For me to live is Christ.
Yeah,
As in, you can't do that. You can't be all about Jesus if you're all about everybody else's business.
yeah,
If you're living for other people's approval, if you're trying to have the bigger stick, the bigger house, the nicer car. Um,
yeah,
for me, if I'm going to truly live that out, for me to live as Christ means that there is nothing else that sets the precedent for my life except for Jesus and the path that Jesus has put me on, the equipping that he's given me through the Holy Spirit, and the purpose that he has placed upon my life. That's it. That's number one. And whenever I do that, I think there's this false idea, Alex, that when to make Jesus number one, well, then, what about your family? What about your job, your friends? If I live for none other than Christ, I believe that I will be the best husband I can possibly be, that I'll be the best father I can possibly be, the best pastor and
Yeah.
friend and son and brother.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's so
but
true.
but you can't do that. You can't keep your eyes on Jesus. And I said in one of the sermons I preached, it takes two hands to carry your cross.
Yeah.
And you need to keep both eyes fixed on Jesus. And you can't be doing that if you're constantly looking at other people's lives and you're comparing
Yeah.
yours to theirs.
Yeah. There's another, again, I was kind of thinking about this earlier, knowing what we were going to be talking about. And one of the passages that came to mind was Galatians 6. And that's the passage that, if we know it at all, generally it's because of the fruit of the Spirit. Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit being love and joy and peace, patience, and so forth. But right after that, there's a verse that's meant a lot to me where Paul talks about comparison actually a little bit, and it's Galatians 6:4-5. Let me just, if you don't mind me, like,
Not at all.
pulling it up here. And when I say pulling it up, I'm actually flipping through
I love
a
it.
paper Bible. I don't know why I said
That's
pulling
right.
it up. So Galatians 6, and Paul talks about if anyone, this is Galatians 6:3, if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Each one should test his own actions, then he can take pride in himself without comparing himself to somebody else. So that comparison again was like, all through the early church. And so again, in context of the fruit of the Spirit, like I don't think comparison is just the thief of joy. I think it robs us of all of those things. You could just as easily say comparison is the thief of love. If I'm worried and envious about what my neighbor has, I'm not going to be a neighbor. I'm not going to demonstrate sacrificial love for my neighbor if I'm more worried about, what they have or what I want that they have, or whatever the case in comparison is. Comparison could be called the thief of peace or gentleness, or it robs us of so many things because again, it comes from this place where we're saying there's something that we are lacking. And rather than looking for that in God and Jesus being enough for us and those fruit of the Spirit that he's filling us with being enough, we're saying there must be something more. So I think it's the thief of a lot of things.
Yeah. And it plants the seed of a lot of
Yeah.
things,
Yeah.
of envy, of
Yeah.
hatred, and ultimately a distrust in God and God's goodness, and that he is holding out on me and he's not allowing me to live in the fullness that I could be living in, that I
Yeah.
see other people living in, and that's just simply not the case. Paul, here's Peter and Paul, right? They're in a Roman prison, and not just that, but historians at that time said that they were probably in the lowest, darkest, nastiest parts of the prison, how the Roman prisons were set up. And they weren't, woe is me. They weren't thinking about the other disciples that were out there, not in prison. They were singing praises to God. And I'm thinking, boy, if I'm in that kind of spot, I can't be singing joyfully and rejoicing in my sufferings for Christ if I'm comparing to other people, and envying their freedoms or whatever they're living in.
It's so true, and I think that it goes back to that idea that they're comparing themselves to Jesus again. They're saying, "Hey, this is nothing compared to what Jesus endured. We're sitting here on this, in this horrible situation, but it's nothing compared to the cross." Like that's, to me, like that's so true. Like if we could learn the right comparison in our lives, if I could learn the right comparison in my life, it'd be a lot better.
Well, and let's cap it off like this, Alex. We can never understand a true comparison to the sacrifice of Christ, because while somebody could technically whip me with a cat of nine tails, they could nail me to a wooden cross, and they could shove a spear in my side. I could physically endure the same sufferings of Christ. You and I can never ever endure the same spiritual, emotional, psychological sufferings of Christ, because we aren't innocent.
Yeah.
We do deserve the punishment of our sins.
Yeah.
But not only that, we do not bear the weight of the sins of the world. Jesus was not only innocent, but an innocent man then took the sins of the entire world, past, present, and future, to the cross. He bore them. He felt them. In the anguish, he cried out to God as Father, why have you forsaken me?
Mm.
That we can never compare to. We'll never have to experience that. And so whenever I compare my sufferings and my position in life and my lot to that, how
Yeah.
can I ever live in any different way than humility and gratitude for Jesus doing
Yeah.
something that I'll never have to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So true.
Well, Alex, thank you. Thank you so much for this time. I have very much enjoyed our conversation. I believe this will be a blessing to anybody who gets to take the time, sit in, and listen to this coffee cast. I know that we didn't get to go to our coffee shop, and I hope that we get a chance to do that in the future.
Yeah. Another
But
time.
nonetheless, praise to God for technology.
Yes.
And well, I hope you have a blessed week. All you who are listening in, we will see you next week for episode 5 of the Next Level Coffee Cast for the Watch the Throne series. Take care, everybody. Have a good one.